I'd like to introduce now our first keynote speaker, but as I am doing that, I would also like to ask if we could have the handouts distributed among you. Dr. Jay Richards has handouts for us this morning, so thank you. So our first keynote speaker is Dr. Jay Richards. Dr. Jay Richards is Research Assistant Professor in the Bush School, Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute, Executive Editor of The Stream, and host of the EWTN series, A Force for Good, an episode of which we will be screening at lunch today. In recent years, he has been Distinguished Fellow at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, contributing editor of AEI's publication, The American, visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and research fellow and director of Acton Media at the Acton Institute. Dr. Richards has written on topics ranging from culture, economics, and public policy to natural science, technology, and the environment. His books include two New York Times bestsellers, Infiltrated and Indivisible, and his latest book is titled The Human Advantage: The Future of American Work in an Age of Smart Machines. This latest volume will be out this year, and it is dedicated in memory of Michael Novak. Welcome, Dr. Richards.
Oh, thank you so much, Elizabeth. It really is an honor to be here, and I did something I sometimes do last night. My wife knows this. I totally changed what I wanted to talk about because the more I thought about it, I thought this is a personal event. And so what I wanted to do initially, and we'll do at the end if we have a few minutes, is introduce you to an intellectual program or project that is inspired directly by Michael's work that some of us have embarked upon. And so what you'll have in your hands is a first draft of something that I hope I will be able to describe in such a way that you'll see how it grew out of Michael's work, especially on the intersection of ethics and economics. But I'd like to first tell you the way in which Michael Novak, in particular his work, shaped both my own thinking and actually changed my entire career trajectory, though unexpectedly. And my encounter with Michael, as it was for many people, was initially through his writings. I mean, he was obviously quite prolific, but I was Protestant. My wife and I grew up as Protestants. I was a Presbyterian, basically evangelical. And so through several Protestant schools, from a college to seminary, the only Catholic theologian that we ever read, not counting maybe Augustine, but modern Catholic theologian, was not Michael Novak. It was Gustavo Gutierrez. Sort of famous Latin American sort of founder, or at least founding father of liberation theology. So I read a portion of Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation when I was still in college. I was political science and religion double major. And at the time, I was actually on economic issues, basically a leftist. In fact, there was a while in college in which I would have described myself as a Christian socialist, not a Marxist, not a materialist. I mean, my thinking was not very sophisticated. It was essentially, it went like this. God cares a lot about the poor. The Bible talks a lot about the poor. The socialists talk a lot about the poor, so Christians should be socialists. I mean, this is the sort of, right, when you actually lay it out in analytic form, it's not very impressive. But that, you know, and when you're a freshman in college, you know nothing, and you're reading the Communist Manifesto, these are the kinds of arguments that seize you and can send you off on, you know, on a wild goose chase for several years. That's what happened to me in college. But I kept actually reading economics, and so I had the benefit in some ways. I would read the National Review and the New Republic, for instance, and things like this, because I thought of myself as a good liberal. The effect of this was that by my senior year in college, I had become convinced that of the live alternatives, that is, of the political economies that human beings this side of the kingdom are able to implement, the free society that is limited government, rule of law, individual rights, and economic freedom. That's the best thing you're going to get, at least for doing the kinds of things that we should expect from a political economy, and in particular for doing the kinds of things we should expect from an economy. We don't turn to the economy to solve or answer all of our problems. Economic systems, when they're functioning properly, contribute to human flourishing, but they don't absolutely totalize it. And so I had a sort of intellectual problem, though, because I had never read Michael Novak. I had never read, this was, remember, in the 1980s, I had never read work by folks like the Acton Institute. I had read people like Thomas Sowell, people like F.A. Hayek, right, sort of apostles and defenders of the free economy, but people who had either no or actually somewhat hostile views of Christian theology. I had also managed to read, because I was a male, I was a college student, and this was the 1980s, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, which I know many of you, I know, have read that. No one wants to admit it. I'll admit it. I read Atlas Shrugged. And I read it when I was supposed to be studying for a German final, so you can understand mitigating circumstances. But the book seized me because she was saying things that I thought weren't legal to say in this book, at least considering my sort of surrounding environment as a college student in a very left-wing environment. And so it just sort of seized me. I thought it's obviously propaganda, but there's a long 42-page speech in the middle of this book. This is John Galt speaking, and I managed to read it over and over. So the effect of it was essentially to turn me off completely to socialism and to the communist experiment, but also intellectually to create a conflict in my own mind between what I thought made sense economically and what I thought made sense morally. Because Rand, most of you know, was a hardcore egoist. She was a hardcore atheist. She had a visceral anti-Christian streak. She attacked altruism by name. She would say things like, altruism and capitalism are philosophical opposites. They cannot coexist in the same man and in the same society. So what do you do if you think economic freedom is good on prudential grounds, but it also conflicts morally? There's something kind of fundamentally wrong about it at the foundation. Well, what you do in my case is you don't really pursue the topic any further. You go to seminary and decide, okay, I'm going to do probably pursue an academic degree and end up teaching in a college or seminary, but I won't think about this issue very much. And I had the advantage of graduating from college in 1989 and then going to seminary, and then the Soviet Union collapsing, and the pretense of the viability of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries being exposed for all to see. As late as 1987, I had a political science course on Eastern European politics in which we read documents by the CIA fact book, which estimated that the Soviet Union's economy was about the same strength and vibrancy as the American economy. This is in the late 1980s. This is how utterly delusional we were. And so I thought, okay, insofar as an economic thesis can be tested publicly by history, the thesis of command economies and socialism was tried and failed at the cost of about 100 million lives. So this isn't a deductive proof, but that should be good enough for us intellectually. And so I honestly thought that people like Michael Novak had won. I, again, still didn't know Novak, but I thought the case for the free society has won. I'm never going to argue it because I don't want to get involved in all that Randian stuff. And so I did other things. And in fact, I wrote on the intersection of science, natural science, and Christian theology for years. But in 1991, I ended up at Union Seminary, newly married. And this is Union Seminary in Virginia, a Presbyterian seminary. And I was in a social ethics class. So I had read Hayek, so I thought, oh, what's this going to be? And guess what? I got to read The Theology of Liberation for the third time. Now, this was 1991, 92, that academic year. And so at this point, it was just irritating. Because I thought, are we really going to sort of redo this sort of stuff? And so again, I read the book. At this point, I was much more economically literate and was very irritated by it. Still a Protestant, though. And thought, I'm going to see if anyone's written a critique on this book. And someone had managed to stack the library with one book, I found. Some book called Will It Liberate by some Catholic named Michael Novak. And so I checked it out. I remember this. I don't have this kind of memory about almost any other book. I remember specifically where it was in the library. I remember picking it up. I remember the color of it in the library binding. I remember reading the first 20 pages in the stacks, and I remember reading it late into the night because I had class the next morning. And so I just absolutely absorbed this book. I went to class loaded for bear, with my professor and decided I'm just going to use a couple of Novak's arguments. I'm not going to be, I'm not Austin Roos. I'm not going to be obnoxious about it. I'm going to be diplomatic about it. I'm very careful. Just dip my toe in. I use Austin as am I being too crazy? I'm not, Austin's doing it, you know. That's what you get for sitting with me. And so in any case, I thought I'm just going to take down a couple of arguments. I want to raise these in this seminar-style discussion with this professor. And I remember two arguments. The first one was an idea that was very important in Gutierrez's work called dependency theory. And so at least I'm just going to talk about Gutierrez. I don't want to talk about other liberation theologians. At least in his early writings, he used a type of Marxist social analysis, but rather than talking so much about the capitalist or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, he talked about the North and the South. And the idea of dependency theory at the time was that the South, that is the American South, so Latin and South America, were poor because the North was rich. In other words, the wealth of the North had a causal relationship to the poverty in Central and South America. And until the shackles were sort of thrown off of the Northern imperialists, which at the time weren't exactly colonizing South America, things would never work for Latin America. That was his argument. And we were reading the version of the book that said that. Well, Michael Novak in Will It Liberate, if you haven't read it, actually just, you know what he does? He doesn't sort of bicker about the theology. He doesn't accuse Gutierrez of being a heretic, nothing like that. Novak does what's not all that common in sort of social science writing and theology. That's to say, well, what do the empirical facts say? In other words, what's the evidence that dependency theory is true? Now, that's, in some contexts, that would be unsportsmanlike to raise that question, but it seems relevant, right? Is that true or false? And what he discovered was that, in fact, at the time, this is pre-NAFTA, this is, we're thinking about the 1980s here, there was actually very little economic relationship or interaction between the North and South at all. We were trading with Canada, that is the United States with Europe, with the UK, with countries like Japan at the time, and actually there just wasn't a whole lot of cross-border trade one way or the other. And so the argument that there'd be a causal relationship, if there's not even an association, there can't be a cause, right? An association, a correlation is at least required for you to go ahead and say, okay, now let's see if there's a causal relationship. There wasn't even an association economically for the most part between the North and the South. Dependency theory was false, and more or less demonstrably false. Now it was so decisive that Gutierrez in later versions of theology of liberation actually admitted this. He said, it turns out it wasn't true. Gutierrez himself, if you read him, is a quite nuanced writer. He's not bombastic. And so he actually changed his view on this. I don't know if it was directly because of Novak, but Novak was almost certainly the most prominent thinker to have critiqued this particular aspect of his writing. And so Gutierrez himself changed. I don't think he changed anything else. This happened in a lot of books in 1990 and 91. A book by the evangelical philosopher and writer Ron Sider, who wrote Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, which was a sort of Protestant, I would say, theologically orthodox, economically left-wing book. And if you had read it in the 70s or 80s, it read like a socialist track. In the 90s, he did a third edition, which sounds more free market. Everyone was talking a free market game in the early 1990s. So that's a kind of a long way around of saying, okay, this is my first interaction with Novak, was Will It Liberate? The other argument, by the way, that I used in the class was this assumption that economic trade was a zero-sum game. That if you trade with a party, someone must win and someone must lose. Now, the simplest analysis of an actual genuinely free trade is that it's at least perceived to be mutually beneficial. And so I can remember raising this point again in this class. Remember, I've forgotten almost every other class for 2 years at Union Seminary, but this one, all right? But I remember raising this objection, and the professor literally had nothing to say. So he clearly had absolutely no idea what I was talking about, was completely unfamiliar with the critique. And that was at the point that I realized, okay, this guy's onto something. So I went to the bookstore. I used to go to bookstores in those days where you go, it's a physical place where books are on the shelves. And just looked for any book by Michael Novak. There was a new edition of The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism. Again, absorbed this book and thought, oh, finally someone has done this, has actually articulated a robust Christian vision of society and the person, and has also studied economics well enough to understand that there are theoretical insights and empirical discoveries in the field of economics that any responsible person who wants to propose social policy should know about. That's what set Novak, I think, apart from so many others that were in this debate. At the same time, that settled the issue for me intellectually. And in 1991-92, I also thought there's no reason to have this debate. This is boring now. It's like, am I going to write about phlogiston or the germ theory of disease? You know, I mean, there's certain things you don't pursue academically. And so I didn't give this another thought for several years, even though I continued to be interested in this intersection between ethics and economics. So as I say, I graduated, went on and did graduate work, and wrote on the intersection of theology and natural science. Now we're in the mid and late 1990s. This put me back on college campuses, including a lot of evangelical, conservative evangelical, and some Catholic college campuses. And I discovered, to my dismay, that the I think, culpable confusion, or not entirely culpable confusion I had in the 80s, confusion about basic facts of economic reality, were alive and well in the minds of college students in the late 1990s. The same arguments, the same horrible, demonstrably false arguments about the prospects for the state controlling everything. Same basic ideas. And so I realized, you know, that this debate actually hasn't been won. And in fact, you have to keep making the argument every new generation, because these things, for some reason, are not intuitive. Socialism is morally intuitive. You want to help people, you want society to be prized in the common good, and that is all about that, right? Arguments for markets are rarely explicitly moral. They're more like, well, you know, if we just actually compare the countries that have economic freedom and property rights with those that don't, people in the first set tend not to starve to death, and people in the second set tend to starve to death. So it's a kind of purely utilitarian or practical argument, but it's not kind of morally exciting. That doesn't charge anyone up to hear, you know, actually per capita GDP in these free countries is better. I mean, so you're already tuning out and checking your smartphones. That's what happens when you use these economic arguments. And so I realized, actually, we need to keep doing this. Somebody needs to keep doing this. And this was at the point that I got really interested in the work of the Acton Institute and Father Sirico, which were going concern by that point, started reading all of their material, ended up spending 3 years at the Acton Institute, but became convinced that, in fact, this is a very, very important thing. The moral defense of the free economy and an explicitly Christian and Catholic understanding of it is something that somebody needs to be doing. And I told my wife at one point when my book, Money, Greed, and God came out in 2009, I want to do what Michael Novak did. Explicitly, I'm not going to be an ambassador, I'm not going to win the Templeton Prize, but I want to be part of building that synthesis that so few people seem to be doing. Now, what do I mean by a synthesis? A synthesis is something that's very hard to do, and this is the reason this is so poorly done. Ask yourself this question: why are there not dozens of Michael Novaks? Why is it that so often clerics and religious lay people who write on economic issues don't know the very first lesson about what prices do in microeconomics? I mean, really basic stuff. Why does that happen? Why do you have to actually make really elementary arguments over and over with people that actually are well educated, that have their heart is exactly in the right place, their moral intuitions are straight up, but they actually don't know that the policies they would propose would actually harm people rather than help them? Why is that so rarely done? And I think it's so rarely done because of the intrinsic complexity of not the economic domain as a discipline, but the economic domain of reality. Right, so this is how I would describe, this is obviously Novakian in this analysis, but this is how I would describe the economic domain of reality. God has created a world that is not utterly homogeneous. It fits together, it interacts, but it has intersecting and sometimes concentric spheres of reality. So there's a sphere of physics that has its own integrity, it has its own laws and logic that can be discovered and developed and used to create research programs. And if you do physics as a discipline right, you will increase your knowledge of that domain. There's a domain of chemistry, extremely well understood. In fact, it's basically a complete science. The periodic table didn't exist until somewhat recently, and it was empty. There were some empty spots for a while. It's now filled in. So that's a really well understood natural science, right? So there's the science that's a discipline in universities, and then there's this domain or sphere that we'll call the chemical domain. Does that make sense? So this, the only kind of distinction I want you to make in your minds is there's a difference between the academic discipline called chemistry and the chemical reality. And the goal of the discipline is to approximate in its theorizing and predictions the reality itself, all right? Now what about the economic domain? What is that exactly? Well, it's not the domain of physics, right? What is it that we're trying to study when we do economics? Well, this is complicated. It's something like this. It's that social domain in which human individuals, that's itself a subject of study, human individuals, families, groups, countries, and firms buy, sell, and exchange goods and services and information, usually in the context of scarcity. That's the one I would propose, something like that, all right? That's a social domain. Now, what's counterintuitive to people is that domain also has rules and principles that we can discover after the fact. You might not be able to guess what prices do, but you can, by observation, figure out what prices do. You might not be able to guess the relationship of supply and demand, but you can discover it after the fact. And by studying that domain carefully, you can come up with a system of rules or truths that are a kind of combination of theoretical insights and empirical discoveries. All right? So that's the economic domain. Now, what are we doing when we're interested in, say, Catholic social teaching or ethics more generally? Well, ethics more generally, we're asking normative questions. What ought we to do? What's the right thing to do? What's the thing that's going to be most likely to help people? That's a different kind of question. And yet those are the questions that almost everyone that is willing to listen to discussions about economics is actually interested in. All the business professors know this, right? If someone's interested in poverty or economics or trade, 9 times out of 10 at least, they're interested in it for moral reasons. Kids come to Catholic University, they come to the Bush School, and they want to study economics very often because they want to know why some countries are poor and some countries are rich. So their interest is in these normative questions. But those aren't officially the task of economics. And so to do what Michael Novak did and did so well, you have to figure out a way to integrate let's call the what question, the why question, and the what ought question. The what question is it's an empirical question. What would happen if we do something out here and then we test it? So what would happen if we raise the minimum wage in the city of Seattle? Let's make it interesting, $50 an hour, all right? That's easier to detect, right? You want to really disturb the system, or $100 an hour. And then you just run the experiment. Seattle's doing this, by the way, with its $15 minimum wage. It's the intellectually serious website in which they're analyzing the effects. That's the what question. So in principle, you run an experiment, you just study it, and then you report it. And you can do these kinds of things over and over and see what would happen. And you can if you know economics, you can guess what's going to happen. It's going to harm poorly educated and disadvantaged teenage males and people whose labor is worth the least. And it's going to help people who were just about to get a raise above the minimum wage. We understand this because of the way prices work. All right, so that's just the what question. What happens? Oh, well, there are certain types of unemployment, and a lot of burger joints went to Bellevue out of Seattle and things like that. That's the what question. What's the why question? The why question is, why did that happen? Why did unemployment increase among a particular subject or segment of the population? Well, it happened. You need theory at this point, don't you? You need something like an understanding of supply and demand and an understanding of what prices do in a context of competition. Prices approximate the underlying economic reality. So what a price is in a competitive environment, it tells you something. It's a piece of information about the underlying supply and demand of the thing in question. It's not just a number somebody could come up with. And if you think it's a number somebody could come up with, notice what happens if a gas station tries to charge 5 times more for gasoline than his competitor across the street. It doesn't work. Right? This is such basic economics, it's the first thing you absolutely have to understand. But I can promise you that many well-educated religious people and Catholic intellectuals don't understand this. Lesson one of economics. Now, why is that? They would never imagine, nobody has strong opinions about chemistry without studying it, right? You don't really strong opinions about what the heaviest element is or something like that. There are no bumper stickers about that, right? It never happens. There's lots of bumper stickers about theology, politics, and economics. My best conjecture is that people don't think there's knowledge to be had in those domains. Or they think you don't actually need external knowledge. You can simply read off your moral intuitions and figure out what ought to happen economically. There's nothing additional in economics that you actually need to know other than just your moral intuitions. And so if you are interested in helping the poor in Zambia or in some country, let's say Ethiopia, you might just simply assume, well, we just give the government some money over there and everybody will be fine, right? You don't know anything about the incentives and what the army does or anything. If you knew a little economics, you wouldn't do that. But here's the key point, and the point that Novak understood, I think, better than any thinker I had read at the time, and that very few people still quite understand, is that when it comes to economic policy, first of all, policy isn't an aspiration. An aspiration is one thing, a principle is another thing, and a policy is still a third thing. But to be able to ask, with respect to policy, what ought we to do, you need some knowledge of the what and the why question. In other words, you don't actually know, should we raise the minimum wage in Seattle to $50 an hour? You can't possibly answer that with any confidence if you don't know what's likely to happen based upon previous observations and good theoretical assumptions. So if you just are able to communicate to people in discussions on these things that, there's actually some economic knowledge having to do with this question, and let's talk about that, and then let's calculate that in when we're talking about policy. We're more likely to actually help people rather than to hurt people. Now that's one of the most, I think, important intellectual exercises for all of us to make, especially if we're involved in proposing things and making normative claims, especially with respect to policy. This is something that Michael Novak, because I think he was a sympathetic thinker and a reader, he was able to get inside the argument of someone with whom he disagreed. So well that I think if Gustavo Gutierrez were to read his summary of of his own work, would say, that's an accurate summary. Now, would people say that if you're a writer about you? Would they say about me? Would someone I'm criticizing be able to look at my rendition of their argument and say, Richards has gotten me accurately. I disagree with him, but he's not being uncharitable. You could say that about Michael Novak's written work. He felt things very, very passionately, but he was always very careful to formulate the views with which he disagreed in the most charitable possible light, and then to demolish them, which is really more impressive. That's a much more impressive move, right, than the straw man that you easily kill. But that actually requires getting in detail into the argument. And so I think, honestly, what Michael started is something that many of the people in this room this morning are trying to carry on. And it's this attempt to create a synthesis between what we might call the what, the why, and the what ought questions. But of course, there's another what question I haven't referred to, because theology in Catholic social teaching, it's not just normative claims. Catholic social teaching isn't just be nice to people, let there be families. There are also propositional claims, truth claims about the human person. The human person is such that as a creature made in the image of God, the state and other people ought to respect it and bestow upon it its proper dignity, right? That's a truth claim. That's not just a moral claim, don't kill people. That's a claim about the nature of persons. And so what we really need to do is we need to integrate the what with respect to known economic truths, the why with respect to known sort of theoretical answers, and then the what and the what ought that we get from both ethics and theology. That's hard. It's much easier if you're an academic to just keep digging the hole a little deeper in one spot. It's much harder to try to command some competence in all these areas and then figure out how to synthesize them. And so in part because that's just so darn hard, and I think it works against the normal academic life and the incentives we have as academics, that's tough. I think that Michael being at a think tank like the American Enterprise Institute for much of his career allowed him to do those kinds of things. So it was a wonderful blessing to have him here then at the very end of his life, which I think was both a coming a full circle, but also bringing him here to where other thinkers actually see themselves as carrying on the work that he began. So that's all I wanted to say, but I then did want to give you an example of what I think is the kind of thing I hope people will do, and so I'm using myself as the guinea pig here. So what you have in your hands here is what I realized you can't find anywhere. And so when you read Michael Novak's work, especially his social philosophy and his economic work, what you'll discover if you studied economics, this guy knows a lot of economics. But he also writes in the vernacular. He writes beautifully, and he's able to apply it with facility on ethical questions and also bring a robustly Christian and Catholic understanding of the human person, which is generally lacking among professional economists. So I love F.A. Hayek's argument against socialist planning. I don't want his metaphysic or his anthropology. And so our job is not take your favorite economist, take Hayek, and then add the social encyclicals. And that's not going to work. That's easy, but it's going to be wrong and incoherent. I know a fellow, I won't mention him, he's a really good guy, he's an evangelical Christian that's trying to create a synthesis of Christian theology and Ayn Rand's economics. Right? You can see how difficult this is. That's not probably going to work. We need this kind of synthesis. But the question is, okay, so for people that aren't economists, what are these truths? What are the things that all economists, if we got Paul Krugman in here and Frederick Saute and Catherine Pacalek and were able to bring in F.A. Hayek and Thomas Sowell, locked the doors and said, okay, I want to see the stuff that you guys agree on. I've actually tried this in symposia before, and they just start arguing, even though I know there's a bunch of stuff you agree on. And so what I decided to do was to try to construct, with the help of colleagues, a list of propositions, truth claims that economists either know or justifiably believe, and more or less know universally. These are the sorts of things. Now, so what's happening here is a philosopher is finally just writing a thing saying, oh, you economists don't ever agree, but here's the kinds of things that you agree on. And so I thought at least the way to get this started is to kind of send it out into the public domain. And so I won't read this whole thing, but I hope you will look at it, because in the middle, what I do is I list what I call 30 things economists know. And these are 30 things economists know and all of us need to understand if we're going to propose policies, if we're going to construct social philosophies that are both appropriate to the human person and to human society and actually help people rather than harm them. So read this in your spare time, and then if you have thoughts or additional propositions or even better ways of formulating this, that's what I'd love to have. And my email is as easy as it can be, richards@cua.edu. There are 6,000 people here, and I'm only one Richards. I guess it's the kind of radically ethnic nature of the name. One Richards. Now my daughter's here, so I had to tweak it. But think through this, and if you have ideas, what I really want to have happen is I would like there to be a kind of body of things it's a body of truths. Sounds a little simplistic, but the things economists know and that all of us need to take account of. And since we didn't find it in any one particular place, I thought I'd just go ahead and get the ball rolling. The truth of the matter is, the future and the success of the project that Michael Novak started will depend upon synthesizers of both the moral and the anthropological and the economic question. Thank you very much. So apparently we have time for questions and suggestions. I didn't want to do questions because I was afraid someone would savage this list, but well, let's do that anyway. It's not online, so this was not made public until just now. My colleagues Richard Gallenstein, who's here, actually helped with the formulation of some of these, and Frederick Saute, and a couple of other economists, and Catherine Pacalek had read it, but I've been sending it out to wider and wider circles, and since this was explicitly inspired by Michael's work, I just thought it might be appropriate to go ahead and give it its first exposure here at this conference. And so do we have a mic that needs to go around? So do we just pass one of these around? And so if you have questions or comments, and then somebody will, oh, this right here. Terrific. So far as I can tell, we have trouble at CUA with this room and audio, but it's worked this morning. So Michael's praying for us, I think. So any questions or comments? Right over here.
Jay, that was really an excellent talk, and this is, I think, a very helpful synthesis. And I'm wondering if you've come across a school of thought called critical realism, because you're using
Yes.
a sort of realist approach.
Absolutely.
And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the approach there in terms of, because there's economists, particularly at the Cardiff Business School, that really specialize
Absolutely.
on trying to sort of get at the causal powers of various emergent structures of markets or certain structures firms, and then one of the things they really try to emphasize is what are the various kinds of conditions for activating or inhibiting certain powers, right? So if a market has various kinds of possible outcomes, and so some of the mechanisms you have here require certain conditions in order to operate, right? And one of the ones I'm particularly keen about, just thinking about Michael Novak's work, is virtue, right? So talking about a virtuous society. I'm wondering if you can comment on the role of that.
So 2 questions, and remind me if I don't get to the first one. But the second one of the propositions is essentially the virtue claim. And so what I discovered, in coming up with this list, what I did is I essentially got Alex Tabarrok and Tyler Cowen's economics textbook, the textbook that's actually used in micro here, by Paul Krugman and people like that, and said, okay, what are they sort of presupposing? And it's so obvious they don't need to articulate. That's how I came up with this list. I was pleased to discover that economists generally now take for granted the kind of institutional questions. That they, even though they don't talk about it or don't quite know how to articulate it, they know that the health of families, that the health of legal institutions, that the health of banks, personal morality are relevant. And and so that's something that I actually treat as something I frame it in a very general way. So it's not, every economist isn't going to say you need to have a Catholic understanding of the human person, right? But they're going to say, actually, social mores are important for economic prosperity. And so I go ahead and put that as one of the things economists know. I'm not implying that economists know these uniquely and that everything they know is, mutually exclusive. I mean, the first one, human beings sometimes act for purposes, right? That's something we all presuppose. But if you're a materialist, you presuppose it and actually deny it in your philosophy. So the question about critical realism, I am very familiar with it. In fact, in graduate school, I wrote a master's thesis on Michael Polanyi, trying to basically argue that I thought Polanyi handled what we came to call postmodernism better than either Thomas Kuhn or any of the French guys. And so I'm very familiar with it. I've gotten away from it only simply because I think I've frankly become more Thomistic and Aristotelian in my own view. But of course, as a simple kind of concession, we know that there's slippage between the categories we use to describe the world and the world itself. And so we want to understand that. That's precisely why we want there to be a dialectical interaction between our theoretical assumptions and our observations. So in physics or chemistry, your observations might be experimental. If you're doing astronomy, you can't stick a thermometer in a star, so it's a type of observational endeavor. If you're doing historical science, the origin of life, the origin of the universe, I would still say that's a natural science, but your evidence, the theory and evidence are just barely related at that point, right? And so in economics, I think at the level of microeconomics, and in fact, what I noticed in working out this list is that most of this stuff is the subject of micro rather than macroeconomics. And I have a section at the end on what economists debate. It's almost all macroeconomics and what causes business cycles and crashes and things like that. I actually think that's because, quite frankly, those things are much more theory-laden. But of course, you don't want to be the kind of realist that's so naive you just simply equate your categories with reality. But I also think that there's a danger in critical realism that it passes over into a type of anti-realism and Kantianism. And I just don't give Kant quite as much due as many other people in the modern academy. My daughter's studying Kant right now, and so, which is a lot of fun, by the way. So I hope that gives some direction.
Hi, John Soliday. I'm an economist. I think Hayek thought, and the Austrian school thought that many of the social mores, norms, were evolutionary.
Yes.
That the market, in fact, created or helped support these things, because
right.
if you do these right living things, you will succeed. This generally assumes competition. It might be viewed that strict kind of silo approach of economics outside of religion can be also considered supportive of the religious tenets and not at conflict. And that is that, indeed, perhaps Hayek's scorning religion was inappropriate, because in effect he was supporting it. Anyway, and your thoughts on that?
It's a great point, and I don't want to suggest that every department or every academic has to do this interdisciplinary stuff. And in fact, I don't think there's anything wrong methodologically if a group of economists just says, we want to just focus on the descriptive task. We're going to not do normative questions. We're just going to collect data and develop more rigorous theories to describe that data, and we're going to suspend the normative question. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's a kind of Duhemian science at that point. The difficulty is, of course, that when it comes to economics, everyone's actually interested also in normative questions, and that includes economists who often make sort of policy positions. And so I guess what I would call for is, both in universities and the kind of writing public at large, a synthesizing function. It doesn't have to happen in every economics school or anything like that, though. But what you said about Hayek is exactly right. Hayek's argument, especially toward the end of his life when he became more sympathetic to religion, nevertheless, he gives, I would call it a broadly Darwinian argument for what he calls the extended order. So you just sort of imagine natural selection selecting different kinds of social structures. And if you're a society that says we should eat our first, second, third, and fourth child at birth, right? So imagine a society like that. That would have poor selective advantage, right? They don't live on. It's like the Shakers. They disappeared in one generation. Whereas if you say our culture that prizes monogamy, the protection of children, respect for the property of others, and these kinds of things, turns out there are these epiphenomena that have economic value, and so there's a logic to the tradition that we happen to have inherited in the West. I think that argument's right insofar as you're just treating natural selection as a pruner, which I think it's very good at doing. It's good at weeding out things. I don't think it's a very good creative force, and it doesn't justify a more robust kind of understanding of human dignity Catholics would believe.
In fact, natural law itself and these morals can be considered as maybe God's will, and the economists haven't figured that out. But they got close, and they're not necessarily pointing to the devil. This is not support for some hedonist maximizing utility, some pig. That's not what. In fact, that's not what the Austrians were about either. It was a logical system.
Not at all. Absolutely, I totally agree.